Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Kneindyke. I'm the president of Refugees International, and it is our honor to welcome you all today for this fantastic panel discussion on the Rohingya crisis. We are really pleased to host this with Refugees International fellow Lucky Karim, who is one of our refugee fellows this year, uh, with Refugees International advisor and former winner of our Richard Holbrooke Prize, Tun Kin, and with John Quinley of Fortify Rights. I'm going to say a few words at the top here, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dan Sullivan, who leads our work with on this portfolio to run the discussion. Refugees International has a really long history of working on Rohingya issues going back to the early 90s. Um, the challenges that we're seeing today are, uh, obviously quite extreme, quite concerning, but also I think reflective of some of the broader challenges with refugee and humanitarian funding and with refugee rights and protection and non-refoulement protections that we are seeing in a lot of countries around the world. And so the panelists will dive in and talk about how we're seeing some of that manifest. There's also an interesting potential, I stress potential opportunity as things are shifting a bit with the new interim government in Bangladesh, taking a somewhat different and more constructive approach to the refugees, and also changes in the security situation and um, uh, control of Myanmar's Rakhine state. And that is creating some very fragile and a tentative but potentially promising openings towards different durable solutions for some of the Rohingya people. But that's also imperiled by the aid cuts and by the somewhat shifting and disengaged nature of U.S. leadership in the region. So earlier this year, Lucky and Dan traveled together on a Refugees International research trip to the camps in Bangladesh and produced a really powerful and thoughtful and smart report on some of the ways forward for Rohingya refugees. Um, and there is a high-level meeting coming in September on the margins of the UN meetings that presents an interesting political and diplomatic opportunity. So we're really looking forward to hearing some of the thoughts from the panelists today on how to capitalize on that opportunity of that specific event, but also the the wider shifting political opportunities that we see with some of the changes both in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. I'm going to hand over to Dan in just a moment to moderate, but before I do, I can't um, fail to address the news that came out last night of the new U.S. travel ban, which, amongst other countries, includes Myanmar or Burma. Refugees International fully and forcefully condemns that ban. It is a discriminatory, harmful, bigoted policy. We have a formal statement coming out imminently condemning it. And I just wanted to say in this venue, since we are talking about Rohingya refugees, people from Myanmar, that we stand with the people who are fleeing and who need protection in the United States, and we stand firmly against any attempt at banning them from entering and receiving protection here. With that, I'm going to turn over to Dan now to moderate the rest of this event, and we'll kick off with a short video. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Let me just start as a way of introduction. I'm lead our work on the Rohingya with Refugees International and have been traveling to the camps in Bangladesh for a number of years. Had the opportunity, one of my first trips with Refugees International almost 10 years ago now, to travel with Tun Kin, and have collaborated with John Quinley of Fortify Rights on several different efforts over the years. He continues to do a lot of important work working with human rights defenders and general human rights advocacy in South and Southeast Asia. And then, a couple almost 3 years ago now, I was in the camps and first met Lucky as part of a round table. She was living in the camps at the time, and now 2, 3 years later, she's in the U.S. We've joined with her as a refugee fellow, and had the opportunity to travel with her earlier this year. And I just want to give a recognition to Lucky in being the real impetus behind the report, the travel we did, and the and this event. So we're gonna dive into a bunch of different questions about the current aid situation and broader. But first, I want to start with a video that just covers very short, couple minutes, part of Lucky's return visit as she was one of the first Rohingya resettled to the United States after the genocide in 2017, and was the first Rohingya recently resettled Rohingya to return to the camp. So with that, let's roll the video. Thanks.
I didn't choose or decide to be a refugee or start my work at a very young age, but that's the only option I had to support my family, myself, and my community. I took my activism as a responsibility, not as a job. My name is Lucky Karim, originally from Burma, Myanmar. Back in 2017, after the genocide against Rohingya and against community were committed by the Burmese military, I was forced to flee my home when I was just 14, and I spent over 6 years as refugee in the world's largest refugee camp in Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar, before getting resettled to the United States in December 2022. I was the first resettled Rohingya to be able to go back to the refugee camp. I was welcomed by everyone. All of them were so happy and excited to have me back. It was very emotional, a mix of emotions. Seeing my grandmother for the first time after 2 years was very emotional for me. As I said, we're very close to each other. We shared the house together for my entire life until I was 14, right? So she's almost like my mother. I'm so grateful for the opportunity that I was able to go back, and especially meet with some new arrivals who recently arrived from my hometown, Mongdo. My community had thousands of questions for me about their future, when they can go home, how their future might look like. It was not easy for me to say goodbye, not having any solution or answer to their questions. Very emotional seeing them still in the same place, same positions, and even the situation have gotten worse since I left. So yeah, it was very emotional. So I think I was already familiar with Refugees International even before I joined formally as a fellow. So they have been so supportive, direct supportive of my work. And as I said, they're not a stranger to the community or the work that I do. They did everything they could to take me back to refugee camp. So I think that already ends the story. So they've done quite a lot. I'm committed to my work, to continue my work and my fight until everyone is safe in Myanmar. And none of us are safe until everyone is safe in Myanmar. That's my ultimate goal. The world should not turn away from Rohingya, simply.
All right, with that, I want to jump into the discussion. Just a quick word on logistics. There is a Q&A function, so we'll have a discussion with I'll ask a couple of questions to each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to question and answers. So throughout that, please feel free to enter questions as we go along. Yeah, just to start us off, I think Jeremy framed things nicely at the top. There's a couple of fragile opportunities that we're opening, both in terms of with the interim government stance in Bangladesh and with the changes in Rakhine State, but that the aid cuts have really threatened that. Not to mention what the direct effects they're having in the camps. And when Lucky and I were there, you already saw that with the number of hundreds of volunteers who were losing their positions and their stipends, which were really critical supplements to the rations that they were getting. We saw, hospitals or medical centers stopping all but emergency care, and we just barely avoided a drastic cut in rations by half that really would have had catastrophic effects. But even today, we're seeing just in the last couple of days with the announcement by UNICEF that due to the cuts, they'll have to shut down most of the learning centers. We've seen the effects of landslides because of the rain, something that humanitarian officials really put at the top of what they were warning us. They were worried about going forward, not having the ability to prepare for those kinds of things. So yeah, very, very dangerous. And what we've heard is that it's very likely only to get worse. So trying to think of ways and push for ways that we can get funding going back there, and to support those who are on the ground working on this in the front lines. So with that, let me turn it over to Lucky with the first question. So we just saw this great video, got the background. Could you tell us a little bit about what you saw, what the conditions in the camps were, and generally just what it was like going back to Bangladesh after a couple of years? Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. It was, as you've seen in the video, it was just after 2 years I was able to go back. The situation simply has gotten worse since I left in Bangladesh. Few things came out was the big topic for our conversations were when we were still in Dhaka, WFP, the World Food Program, were expecting to have the announcement of ration food cards for every single refugee per month to go down to $6 from 12. So that was the big topic of questions and the conversations when we were still in Bangladesh. The UN officials, UN agencies were having conversations with different donor countries to see if any donor would step up and prevent that food reduction from WFP. So I was so worried for both the UN officials and the Rohingya community in Cox's Bazar to expect the food ration cards. We've seen results in the past. We've had the ration food cards from WFP went down to $10 one time and the $8 the other time. So we've seen a lot of results already. Hundreds of refugees taking risks all the way to travel on a tiny boat for weeks to neighboring countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, when the Russian food cuts happened in the past. So it would have been even more worse this time, going down to almost more than half. But thankfully and gratefully, the US has stepped up at the very last minute to say they would continue their funding to prevent that Russian cut reduction from WFP. Which means it's only keeping the limited amount of foods and the minimum amount of foods that every single refugee receives from WFP every month. It doesn't improve any condition or situations in the camp. It's only keeping the same amount of food that they receive from WFP. And of course, because of the global aid cuts, the learning centers, which we have seen just last week from UNICEF, and those learning centers are always referred to be called the child-friendly spaces for kids. And it's not still for adults, it's only for the kids. And those have been closed down already in the camps. So that's a result of human trafficking and forced recruitment in the camp for kids. Well, they have nothing to do in their tiny shelters all day, all night. And we can already imagine how many refugees might risk themselves to travel to different other countries, expecting a better life. And they only see and realize how dangerous it would be for them when they arrive at their destinations. And of course, there's no livelihood opportunities for families with zero income, for people with disabilities, or for kids in the camp yet. And this is another big topic of our conversations that we've had with the government officials in Dhaka and the UN agencies, of course. And it's very important when refugees are very relying on and dependent on the humanitarian aids coming from WFP every month and having no incomes at all, that they would have some opportunities for livelihood so they could make their own money and then at least survive on a minimum amount of aids, which we haven't seen yet. And there's no changes from the past experience of both my work and the lived in the camps. And of course, human trafficking is another big issue. People still suffer on a daily basis. A lot of people, including men, women, children, are being taken away from the camps and being asked to pay a large amount of money for their release by the non-state actors, by human traffickers. That includes both from host community and the Rohingya communities. And it's been really risky for refugees even to survive and take on a taxi within the refugee camps. given their situations in the current environment in the camp, not having lack of livelihoods, lack of jobs, lack of income, people are just starving, and finding ways to make money from whatever resources we take them to do. And of course, that includes women issues, and for girls and women's, including GBVs, child protection, when women protection centers that used to serve, especially the most vulnerable individuals, women and girls in the camp, have been closed down because of the aid cuts. So the women who used to have access to some of those services and much needed facilities are no longer serving the women and girls in the camps. These were some of the recent changes we've seen since the aid cuts announcement. But of course, that is connected to all other situations that refugees have in the camps, including educations, protections, and of course the livelihood and shelter, which is one of the big issue, again, part of our conversations. Shelter is not covered by any NGOs or any government yet. And a lot of the new arrivals from both Mongdo and Butidong recently are not being offered any shelter in the camps. And the only land, the tiny land they have to buy is with a lot of money from the host community. A lot of the refugees cannot offer because they're coming from Myanmar with almost nothing. What they do usually sleep during the night at a mosque or a masjid. And they can use those empty spaces only during the night, and during the daytime, no matter how the rainy or hot season is, they would have to be outside waiting somewhere else. So it's kind of, the shelter is another big issue again, and they've been offered some empty shelters in camps like Camp 20 Extension, Camp 4 Extension, which is kind of isolated locations in the camp and far away from the main road and other services. And those camps are always referred to be the dangerous places of the camp, where a lot of the armed groups operate during the night and day. So refugees don't make decisions and take risks to go and relocate to those places while they're still just escaping away from the genocide in Myanmar and going through some of the mental issues. So I'll stop there, maybe if you have any specific question. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucky. Yeah, and you mentioned the armed groups in the camps, and when we were there, that was one of the somewhat positive things we were hearing from Rohingya refugees was that, relatively speaking, the security situation has improved in recent months since there was a sort of agreement brokered with the Rohingya armed groups operating in the camps. However, we know that that's very fragile. And over the past couple of years, have been lots of incidences of killings and attacks and extortion and forced recruitment going on in the camps. And John, you and Fortify Rights have documented this and the broader kind of just security and protection concerns within the camps. Could you talk a little bit about what you've seen and what your recommendations are?
Yeah, thanks, Dan and Refugees International for having me. It's an honor also to speak alongside Lucky and Toonkin. I've learned so much from you both over the years, so it's a real honor to be on the panel. As Dan mentioned, Fortify Rights did a few years of research on the armed groups in the camps and the ways that they're trying to vie for control and power. So we documented quite egregious violations, including killings, detention, torture, threats, and harassment. Luckily, the truce that took place in November, as Dan mentioned, has seen a decrease in some of the more egregious crimes like killings. But what we do see still is armed groups in the camps using threats and harassment to not allow real leadership and real representation outside of those Rohingya armed groups. And so being a human rights defender, being a political activist, trying to represent your Rohingya community like Lucky has done in the camps or others are doing is very dangerous. It's a dangerous activity. And so we've been calling on the Bangladeshi authorities to lessen the severe restrictions that they've put in place over many years. The restrictions on refugee lives are real. They were really severe under the former brutal regime of Sheikh Hasina. But unfortunately, under Mohammed Yunus's interim government, a lot of the restrictions haven't been lifted in really meaningful ways. And so as Lucky mentioned, you still have restrictions on widespread formal education. There's a very small pilot project, but that's coming under threat because of donor cuts. You don't have any real access to work. And the reality is refugees don't have legal status. These are severe restrictions. Every part of your life is restricted. And so for people to have safety and security and dignity, the Muhammad Yunus interim government and the future government in Bangladesh, whether it be BNP or someone else, really needs to lift these egregious restrictions and start looking at middle term and long term solutions for refugees. And lifting those restrictions will hopefully help those refugees that are facing threats from armed groups, and it will also allow regular refugees abilities to work, live dignified lives, access education, move about freely. There's no freedom of movement in the camps right now. So these are things that we're actively trying to talk to the new interim government about, and I know Lucky and Dan met with them recently, but also the potential future government, whether it be BNP or this new Citizens Party, the Youth Party, who have a lot of sway in the country now. These are groups that we really should be engaging with because there's a lot of discriminatory rhetoric coming out of the Bangladeshi political scene. And so trying to make the masses understand that refugees are not a threat. They're not a national security threat. They're not a threat to the democracy in Bangladesh, but they should be protected and supported is something that we're also trying to do actively and working with the student groups to try to normalize relations with refugees in places like Cox's and Chittagong. Thanks, Dan. I'll pass it off to you all.
Thanks, John, and we'll come back to you again. But first, let me turn to Toon Kin. Toon Kin, you've traveled recently also to Bangladesh, but also done a lot of research on the conditions inside Rakhine State. And as I understand, you'll have a report coming out soon on that. Could you update us a little bit on what are the current dynamics and conditions faced by Rohingya who are still in Rakhine State?
Sure, thanks, John. Thanks, Dan, inviting me in this timely event, and good to see you all, familiar face in this panel. And thanks to Refugees International continued support on Rohingya issue. And thanks, John, for your great work. Thanks to Lucky, your visit is very inspiring, and the video is really emotional anyway. So let me start about regarding on current situation in the other side of the North River, which is Rakhine State. Firstly, Rohingya communities across Rakhine State are facing starvation. They desperately need food assistance. If they do not get it very soon, we worry that large numbers of people, especially children, will die. And secondly, that our economy continuing to perpetrate human rights violations against Rohingya communities, especially in Butidong and Mount Township. Thirdly, the situation is so desperate, and the large numbers of Rohingyas are taking huge risks to flee. They are extremely vulnerable to human traffickers. Let me point out about the starvation. In November last year, UNDP warned that famine was imminent in Rakhine State, with 2 million people at risk of starvation. Since then, we have seen no let-up humanitarian access restriction. The regime has maintained the trade and aid blocks in place since November 2023, including its ban on importing medicine to Rakhine State. At the same time, the crippling aid cuts are having a devastating effect. Like on 14 March, World Food Program warned that 1 million people in Myanmar would be cut off from life-saving food assistance from April. That includes Rohingya confined to camps in central Rakhine State who have no other access to food. There are more than 120,000 Rohingya in the camps in Sittwe. Half of them are children. We are getting reports that many of them receive no food ration at all in March and April. They have had to forage for taro roots and sweet potatoes remains left over from the harvest. People are starving. Families and children are going to camp begging for food. That is what's happening. And people in Sittwe are extremely vulnerable and truly desperate. We have confirmed reports that women from every camp are engaged in sex work purely for their survival. A family of 4 attempted suicide. Sadly, the father died. but his wife and children survived after never saved them. This is not an isolated case. This is so much, there is so much suffering, psychological distress in the camps. And let me point out to you economy violations. Rohingya living under control of economy in Butidong and Mount townships are facing starvation, especially IDPs. In Butidong, some of the Rohingya IDPs who were displaced by the fighting last year report they are only eating low quality rice, sometimes once a day. The curry they can have sometimes is made with leaves. We are very concerned. Children may be showing signs of severe acute malnutrition. According to reports we are getting from the ground, children with severe acute malnutrition need immediate treatment or they will die. In Maundo IDPs, also they are very difficult situation. At least 10 children died from outbreak of diarrhea at Lapokong transit camp, where they were being held by Arkan Army. Arkan Army imposed movement restrictions on Rohingya communities, which prevent them from fishing and farming. They need a permission letter from Arkan Army to go to the market to buy food. It is very difficult for them as they have no income source. In Butidong, some IDPs have allowed to return their original village, but only if they pay a fee to Arkan Army. Rakhine people don't have to pay any such fees. Other Rohingya IDPs have ordered to relocate to places decided by AIM. They are denied the right to return to their original villages. The Arkan Army is consolidating and reconfiguring Rohingya villages, cutting off from their homes and livelihoods, and forcing people to rebuild their lives from scratch with no help or support. People don't have anywhere to live, as houses in those villages were damaged during the fighting and they struggle to buy the materials to rebuild. You all may know that 118,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh since November 2023, according to the government of Bangladesh. The highest number of people arrived in June and July last year. Just this month, more than 400 Rohingya have died at sea after attempting to flee. We have confirmed reports from the ground that Arkan Army is profiteering from human trafficking, both directly and indirectly, in northern and central Rakhine State. Human trafficking groups have to pay Arkan Army to be allowed to operate. People fleeing from Butidong with human traffickers also have to pay the AA departure permit signed by Arkan Army area commander to allow them to travel through AA control areas. In Choctaw Township, Arkan Army is heavily involved in human trafficking. One of our sources told us, even a child will tell you that AA, Arkan Army, and human traffickers are one and the same. Every week, human traffickers take young Rohingya men and women. Over 2,000 Rohingyas are reported to have left Choctaw Township in 2025 alone. Arkan Army is exploiting the vulnerability of the Rohingya for financial gain and clearing them out of Rakhine State. So that is what I just want to update. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tunkin. Yeah, thanks for that really important ground truthing of what's happening. I'll say that in our conversations with refugees during our visit, there was right away the considerations of or the disbelief of how they could work with the Arakan Army and with the Rakhine people, given the atrocities and things that are happening. But there was also a recognition of any long-term sustainable solution. There has to be some working with the Arakan authorities, and so. I won't go into it here, but just to highlight in our report that we talk about, there are a whole series of confidence building measures that the Arakan Army can put forth to show that it's serious about reconciliation, and things like you said, Duncan, of allowing the people who are there now to return to their villages freely and safely, and allowing aid to come in, allowing for accountability for what has been done. So a whole series of things. But let me move now. Another question for Lucky. And I saw in the questions that we have a strand of several questions about, how can the Rohingya community be represented in the camps and globally, and you're in a very kind of unique position, having lived in and grown up in Rakhine State, then spent several years in the camps, and now being in the U.S. As we look at, and this was a lot of our conversations in Bangladesh and since, as we look at this opportunity of a high level meeting on the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities in Myanmar coming up in September, what do you see as what's your hope for your community, and what opportunities do you see going forward?
Thank you. Thanks so much to Koton King and John. This is really helpful, and you might already understand what the situation looks like in Rakhine State inside Myanmar from the presentation and the statement. Just moving forward to your question, I think I've said it many times, and I will say again, we as community need both a short-term and a long-term solutions. And the short-term one includes improving the situations and conditions in the camps for more than 1 million refugees while they're still in the camps. That includes allowing the little amount of livelihood opportunities for families with zero income and disabilities. And of course, having the formal education following the Burmese curriculum to be allowed in the camps for kids and adults. And improving the security risks for refugees so everyone can be protected while they're still in the camps from all non-state actors and whoever it is being committed. And of course, the short-term one also includes for refugees to be allowed to survive freely with no restrictions and with no issues, including having access to durable shelter and the climate changes in the camps. And the long-term one is the ultimate goal, which is repatriation. And to me, as someone who is coming all the way from the ground, repatriation at this time sounds like a little bit tricky for me because I don't see any solutions and any ways for us to even talk about the repatriation at this time. Before we get started on the conversation on how repatriation should look like and when it should happen and who should facilitate that, there are a lot to get us started with. For example, let's get us started with the IDPs inside Myanmar. And Bangladesh is not our country, and repatriation should start from Myanmar. That's where our home is, and that's our country. And the repatriation should come from the Myanmar, and the solution should come from home, meaning that let the IDPs go home first safely, and let the humanitarian relief to be delivered within Rakhine State safely, so the condition and situation gets improved inside Rakhine State, and that will then convince us to go home. So it's very important to improve condition and situations inside the countries. The refugees who are still waiting in the tiny shelter for nearly 8 years will feel safe and ready to go home. And it's so funny to talk about repatriation for refugees who are still in the camps and are still committing the crimes against the remaining members of the community who are still inside Rakhine State. So it's really important to get us started from Myanmar before even we talk about the numbers of people given by the military regime recently during the summit in Thailand, and even before to be eligible and to consider from Bangladesh. And then when it comes to the solutions, again, the long-term one, I've seen a lot of donor countries stepping away from the Rohingya community, including UK, Germany, and others, of course. So again, I want to thank US for always being the largest donors to the Rohingya refugees since the very beginning. And their donations coming from the US is not just providing the foods for the Rohingya community, it is an encouragement for other donors as well to continue the funding. Since the announcement came out from US, we've also seen other donor countries to be discouraged and stepping away from Rohingya. It's really important we have US support both to be engaged and involved in political ways and also the humanitarian fundings. And at the same time, I also want to encourage and ask the other donor countries to continue their support, especially to improve the situations and conditions for refugees who are still in the camps. And it's not just end of this story, but it's one of the many examples. We have at least 30 newborns every month in the camps. So you can already see there's increased number of refugees in the camps. And of course, as Kutunkin has mentioned, there are a lot of new arrivals, especially starting from last year till today from Myanmar. So the numbers are increasing, and we have sadly more people in the camps than less people in Myanmar. So again, connecting to the high-level conference, which is set to happen on the 30th of September in New York, led by the UN, I think it is an opportunity for us, and I call it seasonal attention, sadly, because of the competing priorities in the world, people tend to pay their attention to the new things that comes to their mind, and really taking away their faces from their Rohingya community, which is sad to see is happening quite often, especially since the issues happened in countries like Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere. So the September conference is a little and a small window that we have to grab the much needed attention from the stakeholders, from donors, from government officials and policymakers back to our people in a crisis, and especially hold the people who are responsible for the intentional crimes accountable. And in this conference, what I want to highlight is, again, we will need to make sure refugees who are in the camps are able to survive and are alive, and make sure the condition gets improved inside Myanmar, inside the Rakhine state. And also, it's very important for us to recognize the representation of meaningful participation of Rohingya civil society in any talks, in any conversations. It could be with the authorities in Myanmar, could be with the donors, could be with the host government. It's very important to have Rohingya voices in every travels, and including the high-level conference in September. Not just the meaningful participation, but actually safe participations of Rohingya refugees from the ground, to be included everywhere. Because we know when to go home and when it is safe for us to do so. And it's very important given the few different generations within one community, and of course, given the current environment and situations both inside Myanmar. And we don't have Rohingya to speak up from Myanmar because of the safety and security. And same goes to Bangladesh and other host countries as well. And it's really important to solve internal issues and include the Rohingya voices in any talks and any political conversation or dialogue. So I'll stop there. And this is what the solution we need. And we just need to be straightforward to recommendation and solutions. The stories have been told, and it's been decades long. Rohingya issue is not a new thing. It didn't happen just in 2017. It is a process. It is a political game that have been happening over decades long. So what we need to talk about is right now the solution and the recommendations. That's what we need, not the stories to be repeated over again and again. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucky. John, turning back to you, we touched a little bit on the interim government and some mixed kind of things going on, but in the time that when we visited and just seeing over the years, it has been really stark how much more open the conversations about willingness to talk about livelihood opportunities and education, hiring a dedicated high representative on the Rohingya issue, and several other things that have been said and done in the camps to improve things. That said, we know there's also challenges and there remains to be restrictions on education, on livelihoods, on freedom of movement. And we also know that the interim government has only a matter of months and faces other domestic pressures. So from your research and visits and what you've seen, can you talk a little bit about that balance of the challenges and possible opportunities with the interim government in Bangladesh? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Great question, complicated question. I was in Bangladesh earlier in May, and I met with a number of the different political parties that will run for the elections or try to be in the elections in the coming months. I think one issue is Rohingya is not a major campaign priority for a lot of the groups. It could be potential political suicide for some of the groups. Rohingya people being in Bangladesh is a really contentious issue for Bangladeshi nationals generally, unless you're a very progressive person. There are positive signs. In the early days after Sheikh Hasina was thrown out of power, my colleagues and I went and documented the killings, in the streets against peaceful protesters, and we met with the student leaders. In those early days, the student leaders had from my perspective, fairly anti-refugee sentiments still. These are people that want democracy, want human rights, are protesting in the streets for for a better country, but their ideas of refugees were still not very human rights respecting in my view. But in the last few months, talking to members of the student anti-discrimination student movement, and also young members of the interim government, young members of the political parties like the National Citizens Party, they seem a lot more open to having conversations about Rohingya refugees. And this is really positive because youth movements in Bangladesh and are really now taken seriously in ways that they haven't always been in the past. So I saw that as a really good sign. Dan, you mentioned that Muhammad Yunus did appoint a Rohingya advisor. He's now also the national security advisor. He's a quite high level person. He's the one that's really trying to push the Rohingya conference. Unfortunately, he's also said some worrying things about repatriation. And, of course, as Lucky mentioned, repatriation at this time would be akin to refoulement. There's an parts of active war going on in parts of the country, and the AA is not always a good faith actor. So those are some things that are positive. We do also see the interim government. This is complicated, but they've also been willing to work with the Arkan Army, the ULA, in maybe providing cross-border aid. They've talked about it publicly. There's now debate in the whole of Bangladesh about, okay, we need more information about what this looks like. The army's gotten involved. It's become a really politicized issue. But there were early signs that the interim government was willing to work with the Arkan Army, which I know is not a good faith actor. Us at Fortify Rights has documented egregious crimes by the Arkan Army, including the massacre on the Naf River. But for humanitarian aid to get into Rakhine State, you need to work with some actor. And so at least working with the AA in some way to get cross-border aid into Bangladesh is something that we've advocated for in a small way. And we've seen the interim government be open to it, although there is domestic pushback against that policy, and you see that being debated now. Finally, I think under Hasina, it was actually fairly good too, but under Yunus as well, they're very open to international justice mechanisms. They've invited the ICC. They've had a UN fact-finding mission related to domestic violence. They still allow members of the IIMM into Cox's Bazar. There's offices there. So in this regard, the interim government is doing a really good job and still pushing forward accountability for crimes that happened in Myanmar. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the challenges. Under the Yunus government, we have not seen real practical changes for refugees' daily lives. There are definitely political changes in the Cox's Bazar refugee camps, in the way that they're interacting with people, the security forces particularly. But for refugees just living their lives, the restrictions are still there. Two, repatriation is still their number one kind of thing they talk about. And we did document numerous pushbacks of boats trying to reach Cox's Bazar during really violent times in Rakhine State. I know Refugees International, Amnesty International have also documented those pushbacks under the Yunus government. So that was super concerning for us. And then just finally, and I won't talk too much about this, but there are signs that members of the authorities are working in some way, propping up maybe members of non-state actors or propping up political leaders in the camps that are very worrying. And so that these kind of dialogues that are ongoing, are propping up these actors that don't necessarily have good intentions for the Rohingya community. We've seen an increase in threats and harassment related to forced recruitment. There is a truce in the camps, but that means that there are some actors that are not good faith actors there are potential signs that the Bangladeshi authorities are working very closely with them. And so we just call on the Bangladeshi authorities to investigate crimes when they happen and to hold all perpetrators accountable for crimes in the camps. And we were really glad to see the arrest of Ataullah the member of the Arkan Rohingya Salvation Army that happened in Bangladesh as well. I'll leave it there, Dan.
Thanks, John. I have one more question for Toon Kin, then we'll open up for the questions from the audience. Again, a reminder: there's the Q&A function if you have a question. Toon Kin, as somebody who's worked within the diaspora community and among advocates globally over many years, and seeing the latest opportunity with this high-level conference, but also looking forward ahead, longer term. Curious your thoughts on what opportunities are there and what paths you see or hope for in terms of safe repatriation eventually for the Rohingya back to Rakhine State. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, Dan. That is very important. That one thing, we Rohingya belongs to Burma. We are second largest minority in Rakhine State. After Rakhine, Rohingyas are the largest community. Rohingya have their land, their culture, and their civilization. All our community is manageable minority. We definitely must go home. We must return to our land. It's about 1 million people in the camps, and other diasporas, about 1.5 million. So we are 3 million community. Where we should go? We can see what's happening in the world. India, other countries, how Rohingya has been treated is unbelievable. End of the day, your homeland is your homeland. So that is one thing for the Rohingyas. We must return. And what we can do, our economy need enormous pressure and something like sanctions put in them, and we must get cases, to bring them to get justice, what they have done. And of course, one thing what I can see is we really need international protection. So we have to get straightforward when you talk about what's happening now. 1 year over, our economy continuously, we open up everything. We want to have a dialogue. We want to sit down together. We want to rebuild Arkan. So what's instead they are doing is, by having arms, they getting rid of us. So our point is, we want to rebuild Arkan together after getting rid of military, but they do it different way. So we need, if they showing the power of the arms, we need protection from international community. We Rohingya should be protected. I support, many people may not be agree, I don't know, but as far as I can see, some people saying people safe zone, that we need protected zone or protected area in Rakhine State. Otherwise, Rohingya can ever be returned, or Rohingya will lose their homeland forever. Rohingya will be dying in the sea, and Rohingya will be, as a refugee without hopeless. Where is our future? So that is very important. What our next generation? So I feel this kind of short-term, long-term is really needed. For the short term, our economy, enormous pressure, sanctioning them, pressuring them, and engage, of course, humanitarian corridor, a humanitarian channel, whatever aid needed, that could be done by them. They are there. But UN presence need to be there. International observer or UN observer should be there. That is one thing. And secondly, of course, there is no peace without justice and accountability. We have done a lot of things. Argentina, our case in Argentina recently, 3 months ago, they got arrest warrant. So justice is needed, is maybe taken long. So what our economy is doing, we need justice. They have killed at least 2,500 people in last year. So where is justice? How can you kill as an armed group where you looking for something inclusive Arkan, and you doing crimes against this community where they are on top of facing genocide? So that need to be highlighted. We have seen that international community not speaking up what they are doing against this community. What military Ming Online started genocide, and our army leader Tumyanang is finishing the Rohingya community. We're not moving to under one military boots to another military boots. That is very important. We need to look. We looking inclusive future federal union, accepting, recognizing our rights and citizen everything. We are together, want to live side by side. We stick on peaceful coexistence principle. That's how we live together. But by having a strong armed forces, Arkan army, they cannot go that way. So that is very important. And I believe that international community have leverage. They are different from military. SAC, they never care. Arkan army, they care. So we have to sit down, international community together, and they have to recognize our identity. They have to recognize our rights. And I can see that, why not? We can rebuild our kind of state together. Rohingya have contributed after independence and every part of the country. Of course, Arakan is our land. We together live in side by side. We are happy to rebuild Arakan together. But we need leverage, we need pressure. Without justice and peace, there is no way to move. I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Timken. Yeah, and I think really important to bring up the accountability aspects and also the international idea as well. Here in the U.S., as Jeremy mentioned, we have a work cut out for us pushing back on the travel ban on and getting resettlement started again, and of course the aid cuts. And you mentioned India, and I think that's been one of the most stark recent kind of examples of, not just there's what we can try to do to change things inside Rakhine State and elsewhere, but there's places where people are seeking refuge where they're blatantly being sent back. I mean, it was pretty stark reports of Rohingya being rounded up in India and then literally dumped off of boats off the coast of Myanmar. So yeah, want to highlight that. But we have a few more minutes, so I want to turn to the Q&A, and I'll try to kind of consolidate some of these, but certainly a string of questions about the effects of the USAID cuts. Was USAID the main reason for the conditions being as they are, and a little bit more information about the UNICEF cuts and what effects those are going to have. I'll just say, as Lucky mentioned, the U.S. is not the only donor that has cut funds, but it is the most significant one, as it has been a leader. And yeah, and on the UNICEF cuts, I'll leave it to others, but just to say that the knock-on effects of loss of education, loss of even voluntary jobs, and the communication, both in terms of the WFP cuts and the earlier ration cuts that were pending, and then now the education cuts. It's not. There's a lot of uncertainty among the Rohingya population that we heard about and we continue to hear about, which is causing, psychosocial effects and re-traumatization. So there's a whole string of effects of this. But let me turn it over to the panelists if anyone wants to take on the questions about the aid cuts and specifically the UNICEF shutting down the learning centers.
I would just say, not particularly on the UNICEF shutdowns, but just aid cuts generally. I don't think I mean, it's going to be very difficult to fill the gaps that the US was making when it comes to foreign assistance. That said, the US is not really trying to uphold any kind of rules-based order, any kind of development assistance right now. But countries like Malaysia, countries like Bangladesh, these middle countries in the region have a lot to do and can support in ways that they haven't in the past. We see Middle Eastern countries, OIC is meeting later this year. They've supported in small ways, but if you look at OIC donations, humanitarian assistance, it's not huge for the amount of capital that those countries have. So as we see decreases, I mean, it's a huge gap, right? So I'm not saying it's going to be a perfect, easy way to fill the aid gaps, but I do think we're going to see these middle countries that are actually fighting for, in Bangladesh particularly, fighting for democracy and human rights, really step up when the U.S. is not in the global arena. And so that gives me hope, I think, but I think the pushing on OIC countries would probably be an important next step.
All right. And maybe I think let me throw out a couple questions at once, and then we'll just kind of do a final round as we only have about 5 minutes left. So one series of questions we got was about, how can we ensure Rohingya representation from the camps in these international conversations, recognizing that there are dangers to those who are speaking out and limitations in the camp. So how do you ensure that is part of the continuation from those living in Rakhine, those living in the camps and diaspora in these conversations? And then the second is looking at what are some recommendations for grassroots, for people around the world, what the actions that can be taken to help out with the situation of the Rohingyas? So let me open that up, and maybe we'll go in the reverse order. I'll go Tunkin, John, and then Lucky to close out. Tunkin, first over to you. Whatever parts of that you want to briefly answer. Thanks.
Yeah, one thing is here we have seen many conversations that Rohingyas are many groups, and some are in the camp, some are diaspora, some are in Rakhine State. No matter what, one thing we need to look at that what Rohingya wants. There are many Rohingya groups, many organizations, grassroots level, diaspora, refugee camp. What they all want? They all want to go home, to go their homeland with their rights. There is nothing different you can have except that. That is one thing. For that, I think we all have to, from diaspora communities, we all are one anyway, but diaspora from outside and refugee camps, we should have a facility. So I think there is an opportunity under current Bangladesh government. We can sit down together and we can find out what will be the way we can come together with a political representation. I feel there is some ways now compared with the before. Because, and as far as we can see, refugee camp is quite safety now to visit there. And so the other side, if we can visit, we can sit down. I think there is something we can do together for the political representation from every corner. And grassroots level, that is important that, we have seen a lot of grassroots movement, grassroots level action regarding on what's happening in Gaza, Palestine. Those are really very good. Like here, what I can see is Rohingya community facing genocide. And we can see that internationally a little bit forgotten after Russia, Ukraine issues and Palestine, Gaza issues, that a bit Palestine Israel issue, and we are. So from grassroots level, we really need to continue our campaign and highlighting about these aid cards, especially US government is one of the top donors. Now this is a big crisis. So that's why I mentioned just now, one thing you have to focus to go back to our land. Otherwise, you cannot permanently expect your donors will continue at all. And you cannot permanently, even you can leave this kind of countries. This is what. So where we belong to, that's target we need to stop.
Okay. Thank you, Tunkin. John, over to you.
Yeah, I think just to add on, Dan, you mentioned the pushbacks from India by the Indian authorities to Myanmar. Luckily, we know that those Rohingya people that were pushed into Myanmar were not handed over to junta authorities because so much of Myanmar is now in liberated territory. we know, and it's now been reported that resistance members of the resistance against the Myanmar military supported those Rohingya people that were brought to shore and tried to get them to safe areas, tried to work with them to come up with options to be able to, move on from the area they were dropped off. I say this because I think on Toon Kin's point, there's big opportunities when it comes to Rohingya representation, Rohingya political leadership, both from the national unity government, from the resistance movement as a whole, the state level governments in the country. You look at in Karenni State, you have the IEC, the Interim Executive Council, doing amazing things. So one, you see resistance groups, and the case of these Rohingya being sent back from India into Myanmar and being taken care of by resistance forces. You have a lot of opportunity in the democracy movement in Myanmar now. You also have a lot of opportunity, as Toon Kin said, in Bangladesh, for them to support Rohingya civil society, for them to support freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, political representation in the camps, and for members of the Rohingya community to build a political body, a representative body that can engage with the broader resistance movement in the country. And I think this is really amazing. When it comes to grassroots support, I would just say Lucky Kareem and Toon Kin are both members of nonprofits. Toon Kin is opened one of the best universal jurisdiction complaints that has been filed that led to an issuing of an arrest warrant even before major international accountability processes. Lucky has been an advocate for women's issues, supported women in the camps. She understands the situation and is building a nonprofit that is going to support women and girls. And so I think supporting groups like theirs, the money goes a long way when cuts are happening. So I would just encourage people to reach out to Rohingya-led organizations and to try to support them.
Thanks, John. And Lucky, over to you. Just 1 minute for the last word on, just whether on the how to include the Rohingyas in the camps in the global conversation, on grassroots recommendations, or anything else you want to touch on next.
Okay, I'll be really quick. The only avenue I see right now is to explore. It is the international community and our friends from international community. And we need their support more than ever. And I would say it because of the discouragement from other donor countries stepping away and not really having enough attention from the policymakers and the government itself. So it's really important that we have the international friends on board and supporting our cause and of course supporting our work. And I would again call on them and make sure they are aware of things going on. And it's being said we need a working group among the UN agencies and the international community to monitor the situations on the ground very closely, to be directly engaged with the community-led organizations and the Rohingya advocates in diaspora who are least safe and able to speak out. And the last thing is when it comes to donations, both for Myanmar and for Bangladesh and other countries, is I think the only last thing we can try it is to approach the Gulf state, who have not been so helpful for Rohingya issues and the Muslim countries in Middle East to make sure we are trying the last thing that we could do and make sure people have aids to survive. And the final point, which is to include the representation, is one of my top priority personally, especially as someone who is coming and was isolated for so long for my entire life and never were able to speak out against any of these injustice I've gone through personally, my family has gone through, and the whole community. And I know and I can speak to how they look like to be a refugee and what it means for people to be isolated and locked, both inside Myanmar and in the camps. And it's very important for us to recognize every single windows and opportunities that we see, including talking to and engaging more closely with the interim government before the election happens and making sure we have a concrete agenda and focus before someone comes to the power, someone comes to the house, so nobody goes to the wrong direction. And especially encouraging for to open the doors and to make sure that talks being arranged and organized in the region, in the host country. That includes Rohingya civil society. And I see a lot of opportunities, both given the positive situations improved in Bangladesh. And of course, while we recognize the hard work of Afghan army, and while we also need to make sure they're being held accountable for some of the intentional crimes they've committed against my community. But also it's very important to explore, as Kotunkin has mentioned, to explore the talks and political dialogue with them to rebuild the Rakhine state again together. And Rakhine state does not exist without us or with us, and it has to be both Rakhine and the Rohingya community, as it has always been since the very beginning and since the birth. So I think it's very important while we recognize some of the intentional crimes being committed against us and the people who are still in there, but also it's important for us to explore the opportunities of political dialogue with them and making sure the international community, we have them on board to monitor and facilitate some of those dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucky. Thanks to all the panelists, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. This will be posted online as well if people want to share and come back to it later. Thanks, everyone.